We must defeat Ethiopia, take their land, and make them our slaves! Gas masks on! Hold the line! Fire!
There's a day that Europe never talked about in its textbooks the way it should have. March 1st, 1896. That was the day a black African nation looked a European army in the eye and said no. Not in words, in blood, in bullets, in fire. Italy went to Ethiopia thinking it was going to pick up another colony the same way you pick fruit from a tree. They came back broken. Their general disgraced, their prime minister removed from power, their streets on fire with riots. Europe was shaken, not just Italy, all of Europe. Because if Ethiopia could do it, what did that mean for everyone else trying to hold a continent hostage? That is the question nobody wanted to answer. So let me tell you how it happened. Let's go back to the beginning, not 1896, further back. You need to understand Africa in the late 1800s to understand why this battle meant so much. By that time, European powers had been carving up Africa like it was land that had no owners. Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, they just came, took, and called it theirs. They called it the Scramble for Africa. In 1884 and 1885, these same countries sat down in Berlin, Germany, and held a conference where they divided the entire African continent among themselves. They drew lines on maps, they created borders, they gave each other chunks of land. Nobody from Africa was in that room. Not a single African king, leader, elder, or representative was invited to Berlin. The continent was being split up, and the people who actually lived there had no say. By the early 1890s, almost every piece of Africa had been grabbed by one European country or another. There were only a few places still standing, and one of them was Ethiopia. Ethiopia, which Europeans at the time called Abyssinia, sat in the Horn of Africa. It was ancient. It had its own language, its own writing system, its own church, its own kings and queens going back thousands of years. Ethiopians traced their royal bloodline all the way back to the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This was not a place without identity. This was not a place without history. This was a proud, deeply rooted civilization. But Italy wanted it. Italy at that time was a young country. It only became a unified nation in 1861, just 35 years before this battle, and it was hungry. Britain had colonies, France had colonies, even tiny Belgium had the Congo. Italy felt like it was being left out. It needed to prove itself. It needed an empire. So it set its eyes on East Africa. By the 1880s, Italy had already taken the coastal territory of Eritrea just north of Ethiopia. It also controlled parts of what is now Somalia to the south. Ethiopia was right there in the middle, surrounded on two sides by Italian territory. The plan was clear. They wanted to swallow Ethiopia whole. But they did not come in with guns right away. They came in with paper. In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia signed a treaty. It was called the Treaty of Wuchale, named after a small town in Ethiopia where it was signed. On the surface, it looked like a deal between two governments. Italy would recognize Menelik as the legitimate emperor of Ethiopia. In return, Ethiopia would work with Italy diplomatically and recognize Italian control over Eritrea. That sounds simple enough, but there was a problem hidden inside that treaty, a very deliberate problem. Article 17. That one article, written in two languages, said two completely different things. The Amharic version, the one in Ethiopia's language, said that Ethiopia could use Italy's help in dealing with other European countries if it wanted to. It was optional, a matter of choice. Ethiopia remained fully sovereign. Italy was just an option, like a contact you might call if needed. The Italian version said something else entirely. It said Ethiopia was obligated to go through Italy for all foreign affairs. That meant Ethiopia would not be allowed to deal directly with any other foreign government. Everything had to go through Rome. That is not a partnership. That is a protectorate. That is a colony with a polite name. And Italy immediately started using that Italian version to tell other European governments that Ethiopia was now under Italy's protection. Italy started writing to Britain, to France, to Germany, saying Ethiopia is ours. Nobody told Menelik this was happening, not openly. But eventually, the truth came out. There are different accounts of exactly how it was discovered, but what is known is that when Menelik and his advisors realized what the Italian version said, the reaction was fury. Not confusion, not disbelief, fury. Because the Ethiopians were not stupid. They could read, they could think, and they could see what had been done. A lie was written into a treaty, a trick that was designed to hand over Ethiopia's independence without a single shot being fired. And the person who was loudest about rejecting this position was not Menelik himself, at least not at first. It was his wife, Empress Taitu Batul. You can't tell the story of Adwa without talking about her. You can't. She is one of the most brilliant political figures in all of African history, and she doesn't get nearly enough credit. Taitu was sharp. She was educated. She could read Amharic, Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian church, and she understood political power in a way that was rare. She wasn't a figurehead queen who sat in a corner and looked regal at ceremonies. She was actively involved in governance. She founded a city, Addis Ababa, which remains the capital of Ethiopia to this day. She named it herself. It means new flower. Menelik loved her and respected her judgment. He consulted her on important decisions, and by most accounts, she was not afraid to say what others would not. When the deception in the Treaty of Wuchale was discovered, it was Taitu who pushed back the hardest. Menelik's character was sometimes described as cautious. He preferred to try diplomatic solutions first. He didn't jump to confrontation. But Taitu was not having it. There's a story recorded by historians where an Italian diplomat tried to warn her that rejecting Italy's position would cause Italy to lose its dignity, and Taitu, without flinching, replied, "We too must retain our dignity. You want other countries to see Ethiopia as your protege, but that will never be." Menelik formally denounced the Treaty of Wuchale in 1893. He sent letters to European rulers explaining that the Italian version was a fraud and that Ethiopia had never agreed to be anyone's protectorate. He sent letters to Queen Victoria of Britain, to the President of France, to the Tsar of Russia. The Italian response was to double down. If Ethiopia would not accept being a protectorate through paper, they would make it one through force. And so the war began. But before the actual battle, there's something important to understand about what Menelik was building during these years. He wasn't just a king who happened to win a fight. He was a man who spent years preparing for exactly this moment.
Within 2 months of the call, Menelik had raised an army of about 100,000 soldiers. His wife, Empress Taitu, personally raised and led 6,000 troops herself. Ras Mekanon, the governor of Harar, a man who would later become the father of Emperor Haile Selassie, brought 12,000 troops. Other regional leaders brought their own forces. Women joined the march not just as fighters, but as the backbone of logistics. They carried food, they carried water, they organized supply lines, they cared for the wounded. War runs on more than bullets. It runs on the invisible work that makes everything else possible. And they marched north, nearly 600 miles from Addis Ababa toward the region where the Italians were stationed. Historian Raymond Jonas noted that Menelik's march covered more ground than General Sherman's march to the sea during the American Civil War, more ground than Napoleon's march into Russia. This was not a ragtag group of angry farmers. This was an army, a real army. While Menelik was marching, Italy had its own problems. The Italian commander in East Africa was General Oreste Baratieri. He was actually a well-known military figure in Italy. He had fought in the wars that united Italy. He was celebrated. There was even a famous composer, Verdi, who once sent him a celebratory message about his earlier victories in Africa. But now he was in trouble. His army was about 17,000 strong. Some estimates put it slightly higher, but no source puts it anywhere near Menelik's 100,000. In December 1895, before the main battle, Menelik's forces had already shown what they could do. At a place called Amba Alajay, an Ethiopian force attacked an Italian advance column and crushed it. The Italian commander of that unit died in the fight. Then, in January 1896, Ethiopian forces surrounded an Italian fort at a place called Mekele. They could not break the walls directly, but Taitu, who was there with her troops, proposed a solution: cut off the water. The fort got its water from a spring. Ethiopian forces took control of that spring. The garrison inside had no choice. They surrendered. These were not small victories. They were warnings. Italy did not pay enough attention. Back in Rome, the Italian Prime Minister, Francesco Crispi, was watching the situation with growing anxiety. He was facing political pressure at home. He needed a victory. He needed Baratieri to do something decisive. On February 28, 1896, Crispi sent Baratieri a furious telegram. It called the military situation a military and national disgrace. It was essentially a message telling him to stop waiting and attack. That telegram may have cost Italy the war. That same evening, February 28th, Baratieri called a meeting with his 4 senior generals. They sat together and discussed their options. Retreat was technically on the table. Baratieri himself had been leaning toward it. His supply situation was terrible. Staying put was slowly killing his army through hunger. Retreat to Eritrea to resupply made strategic sense. But his generals pushed back. Retreat was described as politically impossible. Italy could not be seen pulling back from Africans. The national pride was too raw, too tied up in this campaign. So, Baratieri made the decision. They would advance that night, quietly. They would move their 4 brigades through the Ethiopian highlands in the dark and establish strong positions before dawn. From those positions, they would force Menelik either to attack on unfavorable terms or to retreat himself. The plan had a fatal weakness. The maps were wrong. March 1st, 1996, before sunrise, word reached Menelik that the Italians were coming. They were coming. Not in the organized, prepared way the Italians had hoped. They were scattered, confused, and separated in the dark on terrain they did not know. Menelik moved fast. He and Taitu were together at the front with the army. There are accounts that Menelik knelt and prayed that morning before giving the order. He was a deeply religious man. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church was central to Ethiopian identity, and this battle was framed not just as a defense of land, but as a defense of a Christian nation's freedom. Then he gave the order to engage. What followed was not one battle. It was 3 separate engagements happening at almost the same time in different locations on the same battlefield. Albertone's brigade, which had gone too far forward, was the first to be hit. Ethiopian forces swarmed them. The terrain worked against the Italians. Their artillery could not be positioned properly. Their lines collapsed under the sheer weight and speed of the Ethiopian assault. Albertone's brigade was broken. Dabramida's brigade was engaged separately. The initial push from the Ethiopian horsemen was overwhelming. In the first 12 minutes of that engagement, nearly all of the senior officers in that brigade were killed or wounded. Dabramida himself died in the fighting, rallying his men around a sycamore tree. The brigade was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Baratieri's other brigades tried to come to help, but found themselves under coordinated attack before they could regroup. The terrain made it impossible to organize a proper response. Every time Italian units tried to consolidate, they were cut off and overwhelmed. Titu, commanding her own forces, held in reserve and then deployed at the right moment. Her troops swung around and attacked from a direction that cut off Italian escape routes and completed the encirclement of large sections of the Italian force. By afternoon, it was over. The Italians who survived were running. Not retreating in order, running, fleeing through the mountains, throwing down their weapons, abandoning their transport equipment. They left behind all of their cannons. They left behind over 11,000 rifles. They left behind most of their transport equipment. More than 6,000 Italian and colonial troops were dead on the field. Around 3,800 were taken prisoners. Some accounts put the Italian dead even higher. Baratieri's army had been over 70% destroyed. 2 days later, the surviving fragments of the Italian force limped back into Eritrea. The Battle of Adwa was over. Let me tell you what that day cost in human terms, because it is easy to read numbers and forget that these were people. More than 6,000 Italians and their Eritrean colonial soldiers died in a single day in the mountains of northern Ethiopia. These were young men, many of them from poor families in Italy, who had been told they were going to Africa to build glory for their nation. They followed orders. They walked into that night march. They died in unfamiliar mountains far from home. On the Ethiopian side, the losses were also real. Estimates range from 4,000 to 7,000 Ethiopians killed in the single day, and as many as 10,000 wounded. These were farmers, herders, people from every corner of the country who had answered their emperor's call. They also died. Among the prisoners taken were around 3,000 Italian soldiers. Menelik did not execute them. He did not treat them with cruelty. He held them and negotiated their release. Some of them, the ones taken as prisoners from the Eritrean colonial troops, had their right hands and left feet cut off as punishment under Ethiopian law for bearing arms against their neighbors. That's a brutal fact of history, and it should be acknowledged. Menelik himself later reportedly felt uneasy about it, but it happened. The European prisoners were eventually repatriated as part of peace negotiations. Some of them, during their time in Ethiopia, had experiences that were surprisingly human. A few fell in love with Ethiopian women. A few learned the language. They were kept in conditions that were not luxurious, but were not torture either. Menelik understood that how he treated the prisoners would shape how he was seen by the world. He was playing politics at every level.
In Rome, when people heard the scale of the defeat, they took to the streets. Not in celebration, obviously, in anger, in grief, in shock. Crowds gathered outside Parliament. People threw rocks at the residence of Prime Minister Crispi. The police had to come out. Theaters were closed in Rome. Universities were shut down to prevent protests from getting larger. In Naples, troops were called out to control the crowds. Families who had last received letters from their sons before the battle started, going to newspapers, giving them the final letters their boys had written, letters full of confidence, letters saying they would be home soon with stories to tell. Those words, printed in newspapers alongside casualty lists, tore through Italian society. Prime Minister Crispi, the man who had sent that furious telegram pushing Baratieri to attack, resigned on March 9th, 9 days after the battle. His political career was finished. General Baratieri came back to Italy and faced a court-martial. He was charged with abandoning his men on the battlefield. He was eventually acquitted, but his reputation was destroyed. His career was over. He spent his remaining years in a quiet misery. Italy was forced to sit down and negotiate with Ethiopia from a position of total weakness. And this is the part that must be said clearly. Menelik dictated the terms. Italy came to the table with Menelik holding thousands of their soldiers prisoner, his army intact and victorious, and their own military forces in Eritrea scared they were about to be driven into the sea. On October 26, 1896, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa. In that treaty, Italy fully and unconditionally recognized Ethiopia as a sovereign, independent state. The fraudulent Treaty of Wuchale was canceled, done, gone, no protectorate, no control over Ethiopian foreign affairs, nothing. Ethiopia had won. Not just the battle, the war, the political war, the diplomatic war, all of it. Now think about what this meant to the world outside Ethiopia. In 1896, the idea that a white European army could be defeated by African soldiers was not just surprising. For many in Europe and America, it was unthinkable. The whole system of colonialism was built on a story that said Europeans were superior, civilized, advanced, that Africans were primitive, unable to govern themselves, needing European guidance and control. That is what they told themselves to justify taking a continent. Adwa broke that story, not just damaged it, broke it. Russia, which had been supplying Menelik with weapons and had interests in the region, recognized Ethiopia as a nation they could work with directly. France, which also had interests near Ethiopia, signed a border agreement with Menelik in 1897. Britain renegotiated its position on Ethiopian borders. Ethiopia was not just surviving as an independent state, it was being treated by European powers as a legitimate sovereign country that had to be dealt with on its own terms. That was new, that was different, and it came directly from the battlefield of Adwa. But the effects went beyond Europe's diplomatic adjustments. Across Africa, across the Caribbean, across the United States, the news of Adwa spread, and it landed differently in those places than it did in Europe. For black people living under the crushing weight of racism and colonialism, Adwa was not just news, it was oxygen. In the United States, where Jim Crow laws were being enforced violently and black people were being lynched, denied rights, denied humanity, the news of an African nation defeating a European army was electric. Black newspapers covered it extensively. People talked about it in churches, on street corners, in homes. In the Caribbean, Adwa became part of a broader consciousness. Years later, Marcus Garvey, the great Pan-African leader who was born in Jamaica, drew inspiration from Ethiopia's example. The whole Pan-African movement that would later fuel African independence struggles in the 20th century had Adwa as one of its foundational inspirations. Ethiopia became a symbol, not just of one nation's victory, but of the possible, of what could be done when a people decided they were not going to accept what someone else had decided for them. And then there's Menelik himself. After Adwa, he continued to rule Ethiopia for another 17 years. He built infrastructure. He brought the first telephone lines to Ethiopia. He constructed the first railway from Djibouti on the coast to Addis Ababa. He introduced the first modern currency. He opened schools. He modernized his country while keeping it free. That balance, opening Ethiopia to the world without handing it over to the world, was something he managed better than almost any other leader of his era on the continent. But his health declined in his later years. He suffered a series of strokes starting around 1909. By the time he died in December 1913, he had been largely incapacitated for several years. He was 69 years old. He died as what he had always been, an emperor who had kept his country free. He is buried in Addis Ababa, and he is still revered in Ethiopia in a way that goes beyond history. He's something close to a founding father, not of the country itself, because Ethiopia was ancient long before him, but of its modern identity. Now there's another chapter to this story, a darker one, because Italy never forgot. Italy carried the wound of Adwa for decades. It became part of the national story in a way that festered, a humiliation that Italian nationalism could not let go of. And in 1935, nearly 40 years after the battle, someone came along who decided to use that wound. His name was Mussolini. Mussolini was a fascist dictator who had come to power in Italy in the 1920s. He had dreams of building a new Roman Empire. He talked about Italy's greatness constantly, and he talked about Adwa. He used it in his speeches.
He told Italians that the humiliation of 1896 had to be avenged, that Ethiopians had been lucky in 1896, but now Italy would go back and finish what it started. He was deliberate about it. He specifically chose to frame his 1935 invasion as revenge for Adwa. It was not just about resources or territory, though those were factors. It was about the story, about rewriting it. This time, Italy did not send 17,000 men with bad maps. Mussolini sent 500,000 troops. He brought tanks, he brought airplanes, he brought poison gas, mustard gas, which is a chemical weapon banned under international law. He deliberately targeted civilian populations. Villages were bombed. Red Cross medical units were attacked. The world watched, and mostly the world did nothing. Ethiopia, under Emperor Haile Selassie, went to the League of Nations, the international body that was supposed to maintain peace. Haile Selassie himself stood before that body and gave one of the most powerful speeches in the history of that institution. He warned them that if they allowed what was happening to Ethiopia to continue, they were setting a precedent that would eventually come for all of them.
The League of Nations passed weak sanctions against Italy. They excluded oil and other critical resources from those sanctions. They did just enough to look like they were responding without actually stopping anything. Italy occupied Ethiopia from 1936 to 1941, 5 years. And when Italian troops captured the town of Adwa in October 1935, they made a ceremony of it. They announced they had avenged the humiliation of 1896. They took photos, they celebrated. But here's the thing about revenge. It does not undo what happened. It does not change the past. What happened at Adwa in 1896 happened. No invasion, no occupation, no chemical weapons in the mountains, no ceremony could erase March 1st, 1896. Ethiopia was eventually liberated in 1941 when British forces and Ethiopian resistance fighters, the Ethiopian Patriots, drove the Italians out. Haile Selassie returned to Addis Ababa. Italy's African empire collapsed. The occupation happened. The atrocities happened. They must be remembered. But so must the ending of that occupation. I want to come back to Taitu for a moment, because her story does not end at Adwa. After Menelik's health started to collapse, Taitu effectively ran the government for a period. She made decisions, she handled state affairs, she navigated the complex politics of a court where powerful men were jockeying for position. But eventually, the male nobility moved to sideline her. They saw her as a threat to their own influence. There were political moves made against her, and she was eventually pushed out of active governance and into a kind of formal retirement. She died in 1918. When you look at the map of Africa in the first half of the 20th century, it is almost completely colored in European colonial territory. British pink, French blue, Belgian orange, whatever color the cartographers used for Italy. Almost no African country was free. Ethiopia was the exception because of Adwa. Ethiopia kept its independence through both world wars. When the Pan-African Congresses began in the early 20th century, Ethiopia was always held up as proof that Africa could govern itself. Its very existence as a free nation was an argument against the colonial project. When African independence movements grew stronger after World War II, many of their leaders had grown up knowing about Adwa. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. These men and others drew on the idea that Africa had never fully surrendered, that there was always a place that stayed free. When African nations finally started gaining independence in the 50s and 60s, they often looked to Ethiopia as a symbolic elder. The Organization of African Union, which was the forerunner to today's African Union, was founded in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital, in Menelik City. The location was not an accident. Every year on March 2nd, which is now officially celebrated as Adwa Victory Day, Ethiopians remember that day.
There are events in Addis Ababa and across the country. Schools teach it, songs are sung about it, the flag is raised, people speak the names of those who died. There is now an Adwa Victory Memorial Museum in Addis Ababa, opened in recent years, dedicated to the memory of the battle and the people who fought it. It sits in the heart of the city that Taitu founded. The names are still there: Menelik, Taitu, Ras Makonnen, General Mikael, the ordinary soldiers whose names history did not preserve, but whose feet walked that 600-mile march and whose hands held those rifles on that morning. They held something that day. They held not just their ground, not just their country, not just their freedom. They held up a mirror to an entire era and showed the world what it looked like when people decided they would not be owned. That mirror has not broken. It is still there. It still reflects. But history books cannot always tell you what it felt like, what it meant in the bones of people who had been watching their continent disappear piece by piece into European hands, what it meant to wake up the morning of March 2nd, 1896, and know that it was done. Italy had come, Italy had been broken, and Ethiopia was still standing. There are no photographs of Menelik's face that morning. There are no recordings, but there are accounts, witnesses who wrote what they saw. A man who had always appeared steady, dignified, not given to dramatic expressions. On that day, according to those who were present, even he wept. Taitu, who had pushed for this fight from the beginning, who had led her own troops, who had cut off the water supply at Mekelle and helped encircle the Italians at Adwa. She was there when it was confirmed. The battle was won. I do not know exactly what she felt. No one does. But I think about a woman who had spent years fighting not just on a battlefield, but in a palace, in a court full of men who underestimated her, in primitive rooms where she said the things the men around her would not say. A woman who looked an Italian diplomat in the eye and said, "We too must retain our dignity." That woman, on that morning, she had been right. Not just about the battle, about all of it. This story is 128 years old now. 128 years. But it doesn't feel distant, not if you pay attention to what it was really about. It was about a group of people who looked at what the world had decided for them and rejected it, who did the hard, unglamorous, years-long work of preparing for a moment they knew was coming, who unified when division would have been easier, who chose dignity when survival through submission might have been an option. It was about a woman who refused to let her husband hesitate at the most important moment, about a man who had been a prisoner as a child and became one of the most consequential leaders the African continent has ever produced. It was about ordinary people, farmers and herders, mothers and daughters, who walked 600 miles through the Ethiopian highlands to stand on a hillside and say no. And it was about one day, March 1st, 1896, the day Ethiopia broke Italy, the day Africa broke the story that Europe had been telling itself and everyone else. That story has tried to reassemble itself many times since. It showed up again in 1935 with Mussolini and poison gas. It showed up in different forms across the continent for decades after. But the crack that Adwa put in it has never fully closed, because the truth does not disappear just because powerful people would prefer it forgotten. Ethiopia was there. Ethiopia fought. Ethiopia won.